In this session we're going to look at forecasting. An essential aspect of managing any organization is planning for the future. And in order to plan for the future effectively, decision makers rely on forecasting techniques to help them in the decision-making process. Organizations typically employ forecasting to look at areas such as inventory, costs, demand and prices. It's very difficult to tell the future. In fact, many economists would say it's impossible to predict the future, and therefore the whole exercise is a waste of time. In the practical business arena, decision makers will use any tools that they think are valuable in helping them to make a decision. To try and project what costs will be in the future, what demand will be in the future, or prices, etc. This is an important aspect of running a business, to try and anticipate what's likely to happen and to plan for it effectively. Now, there are two approaches to forecasting, a quantitative and a qualitative. And we're going to briefly look at both of these in this session. We'll start with the qualitative approach to forecasting, starting with the Delphi approach. Now, in this case, a panel of experts, each of whom is physically separated from the others and not known to them, is asked to respond to a sequential series of questionnaires. So we have a panel of experts, but they are not sitting together, they are kept apart. They don't know, in fact, who's on the panel, and they're asked to respond to a series of questions. So they're experts giving comments about an issue, and they're not in contact with each other. After each questionnaire, the responses are tabulated, and the information and opinions of the entire group are made known to each of the other panel members. So after everything's been filled out, after each opinion has been given, the results are tabulated and the information and opinions of the entire group are made known to the other panel members. Now the experts may revise their previous forecast response. They may change what they said before. And the process continues until there is some degree of consensus. So this approach is trying to take a panel of experts and ultimately get them to agree on what is likely to happen in the future. And the technique is initially to keep them apart and ask their opinions, and later bring them together and make everything open and clear to them, to see if they can come together and agree what is the likely course of future events. Another approach to the qualitative way of thinking regarding forecasting, another approach is scenario writing. Scenario writing consists of developing scenarios for the future based on well-defined sets of assumptions. So different possibilities for the future are worked out based on certain assumptions. After several different scenarios have been developed, the decision maker determines which is most likely to occur in the future and makes decisions accordingly. So different scenarios, perhaps a very optimistic scenario about the future, perhaps a very pessimistic one, perhaps a not so optimistic and not so pessimistic, and so on. So different scenarios are worked out, and then the decision maker is asked to decide which, in his or her opinion, is the most likely to occur in the future. Now, the qualitative approach to forecasting, well, should it be subjective or interactive approaches? Well, the techniques are often used by committees or panels in seeking to develop new ideas or solve complex problems. So often panels of experts or informed people are brought together to try and work on complex problems, to try and give likely outcomes. Sometimes the subjective or interactive approaches may involve brainstorming sessions. In other words, a facilitator stands at a whiteboard and asks for ideas. No matter how crazy the ideas, everything's written down. And then later they're all tried to be joined up to try and make sense of what was said. And brainstorming really means a very relaxed approach to decision making in the first instance, just simply saying whatever comes into one's head. But later on, joining it all up to try and make a coherent picture. Brainstorming will be looked at in a separate video. It's important in such sessions that any ideas or opinions be permitted to be presented without regard to its relevance and fear of criticism. So with brainstorming, for example, some fairly crazy ideas can be put forward, and some really strange ideas. They're not criticized and they're not laughed at. They're just simply written down and perhaps looked at later and dismissed if deemed not to be appropriate, and perhaps some people may think there's an element of truth and those crazy ideas could be taken into account. Depends. But that is the subjective or interactive approach, to seek opinions and to base decisions based on opinions. The decisions are based on the opinions of informed people normally. Now, the qualitative approaches to forecasting historic data. Well, we have quantitative methods. These are based on the analysis of historic data concerning one or more time series. You see, qualitative techniques are used to make the decision. The decisions are ultimately with the decision maker, and decisions are ultimately a matter of opinion. Now, influencing that opinion, there may be quantitative work, quantitative analysis that influences the opinion. So, in a sense, all decisions are qualitative, but quantitative calculations and quantitative work and quantitative analysis, these contribute to the selection of the future course of action. Now, we sometimes come across this term, a time series. A time series means a set of observations based at successive points in time. So we could look at, let's say, the rate of inflation from 1960 to 2010, let's say. And we'd have simply years along the horizontal axis and the rate of inflation on the vertical axis. And that would be a time series. It's how the data changed over time. If it is historic data, it's sometimes called time series data. Historic data tends to be time series. Quantitative approaches to research are generally preferred. They're generally seen as more reliable. They're also seen as somewhat scientific. They're based on calculations, they're based on statistical theory, econometric methods, they're based on mathematics. So for that reason, they're seen as somehow preferred. But as I said earlier, remember that once the quantitative work has been done, a decision has to be made, and that is ultimately qualitative, that is ultimately subjective. Having said that, now let's just concentrate on quantitative. And let's start by talking about time series data. Well, time series data is usually plotted on a graph to determine the various characteristics or components of the time series data. There are four major components in time series work. We have the trend in the data. So if we look at historic data over a period of time, we try to work out its trend. Is it upwards or downwards? Is it flat? Does it go in a cycle? So is it cyclical? Is there a seasonal component in it? Does it increase around Christmas time and decrease in January? Does it increase over the summer and decrease in winter? Is there a seasonal component? And are there any irregular components? Ones that just seem to happen and that are difficult to account for. Now the components of a time series, well, the trend component this is the long run direction of the time series data. It's, if you like, an average direction of the data. So if production was plotted for a company over a period of time, is the production increasing? So the trend would be upwards. Is the production decreasing? Trend downwards. So the trend component is the long run direction of the data. The long run direction. Any regular patterns of sequences of values above or below the trend is known as a cyclical component. So once we've got the trend, then anything above it or below it constitutes the cyclical component. So we could imagine, if you like, a set of data. We have a trend that's upwards. The data is pointing upwards, but not all the data is pointing upwards. Perhaps some of it is under the line. Why is it under the line? Why is it not all on the line? So there may be cyclical components. And the seasonal components, as I said earlier, these account for regular patterns of variability within certain time periods. For example, over a year, sales may increase around Christmas time, decrease in February and March, increase again around June, decrease around October. So we may have a sort of seasonal component in data which we must be aware of as well. The irregular component of a series of data is caused by short-term, unanticipated and non-recurring factors that affect the value of the time series. Irregular components simply happen. They can be caused by unpredictable adverse climatic conditions. They could be caused by an outbreak of war somewhere else, or some sort of problem, or it could be some good luck as well. But whatever it is, they're not anticipated. Now, when we talk about time series, to actually work out time series, there are two approaches. One is smoothing and the other is trend projection. Some books will have more titles than this, and some will have different headings, but we'll just put it all into two headings: smoothing and trend projection. Now the first one we'll look at here is just looking at a series of data, and we'll give an example. Take a series of data and we'll just plot the data. So if we use Excel, let's say we had a number of weeks. Say we had 10 weeks. I'm only showing 7 here, but let's say we had 10 weeks and we had the sales of pizzas in a 10-week period. Just pretend. And we could use one of the functions to draw a line and illustrate the data using a line. We could use a smooth line, and it shows horizontally the weeks and on the vertical axis, the number of sales. If we fit it all on, we might have something like that just to clear up the image. So here we have 10 weeks. We have the sales of, let's say, pizzas for 10 weeks, and we have a nice smooth pattern just worked out on Excel. Simple as that. Type this into Excel and click the button at the top, and it produces the curve for you. And if you wanted to embed it in the document, make it really pretty, you just embed it and it would look something like that. So in terms of presentation, Excel is pretty good for this sort of thing. However, we're not dealing with presentation here, we're just trying to make sense of the data. Going back to Excel, however, before we finish that, we could use not smoothing, but we could use straight lines. This one is nice and smooth, and this one it's the same data, it's just that you're using straight lines to join it up. And just for completeness, I suppose, we could say we've got, we could do it as a bar chart. Same data, and we've got it looking like that. Or we can just turn it around and have it like that. However, these are presentational things, and a bit of a digression really. So we've got our data, and we enter our data into, let's say, Excel, and we can produce a nice chart. Now let's look at the smoothing methods we've got. Well, in cases in which time series is fairly stable and has no significant trend, seasonal or cyclical effects, it's possible to use a smoothing method to average out the irregular components of the time series. So if it has no significant trend, seasonal or cyclical effects, we may be able to get rid of some of the irregular issues. And three common approaches to smoothing are moving average, weighted moving average, and exponential smoothing. Let's look at the moving average one. Well, our scatter plot for pizza sales has no significant trend, seasonal or cyclical effects. Thus we employ a smoothing technique for forecasting sales. Forecast sales for 11 periods using, let's say, a 3-period moving average, MA3, a 3-period moving average. Now we'll see how this works. It sounds complex, but it's not. So the moving average, well, moving average method. Now the moving average method consists of computing an average of the most recent n data values for the series and using this average for forecasting the value of the time series for the next period. That's our definition. You don't have to know it. You just have to be able to do the calculations and recognize the calculations. But that's our formal definition. Now if we look at, this is our original data here. We have 10 weeks and we have pizza sales. Now if we look at the plot of sales against weeks, we get this blue one, the one we had earlier. We have this blue line up and down. And the moving average is this red one over here. You can see, by the way, it starts on week 4. Now the reason why that happens is that at week 4, what we've done is we've taken the first week, I'll put the cursor on the screen, 111 plus 110 plus 125, and taken an average of those, which is 115.33. Now if we plot the moving average over here, we'll find it's at this point. Then it dips very slightly from 115.33 to 115. Then it increases to 120. Now over a long period of time, to consider that this gets rid of any random effects because it's averaging out the previous 3 time periods. So that's how we're doing it. We're taking, let's say, sales 1, 2, 3, adding them together, taking an average, we get 115.33 and entering that into the 4th week. Now for the next one, which the next one on down here is 115, as you can see. To calculate that, we simply take the 3 above. In other words, we drop everything down by 1. Now we take 110, 125 and 110, take the average 115. And we continue to do it that way, and that gives us our moving average. Now that's how we calculate a moving average. So that job is done. Now the weighted moving average. Well, the weighted moving average consists of computing a weighted average for the most recent n data values for the series and using this weighted average for forecasting the value of the time series for the next period. Now the most recent values, the most recent observations I should say, are given the most weight. We believe that whatever happened most recently is a better indicator. We don't go way back in time. We take the most recent. And all the weights should add up to 1. So a weighted moving average, you simply take the most recent one and give it the most weight. If we go back to this, how that would work is we could give, in this case here, say the 4th one, we could give that a weight of 0.7, this one a 0.2, and this one a 0.1. So 0.7 plus 0.2 plus 0.1 is equal to 1. So we're giving this one the most weight, this one less, and this one less again. Going further back in time, this one is less important to us. So we would work out the moving average based on weights. Based on weights. The regular moving average gives equal weight to the past data values when computing a forecast for the next period. That's what we did initially. We gave everything here, everything had the same weight. We added 2, 3 and 4 weeks together, 110, 125 and 110, as if all of those were equally important. With the weighted moving average, they're not. We're giving the most recent more priority. We're multiplying it by, let's say, 0.7. And week 3 we multiply by 0.2, and week 2 we multiply by 0.1. The weighted moving average allows different weights to be allocated to past values. So it's seen as a more appropriate method. More appropriate in the sense that it allows for most recent experience. Unfortunately, as far as I can see, there is no Excel command for computing this, so you must do it manually. You can enter formulas into Excel and manipulate them to do it and move it around by hand, but there isn't a command as far as I can see for it. If you do find one, or if one comes out in a later edition of Excel, then do let me know. Right, now the smoothing average, weighted moving average thing. So this is what I was saying earlier. We take a 3-period moving average, and we would multiply, let's say, the first one by 0.6 in this case, the second one by 0.3, and the third one by 0.1. 0.6 plus 0.3 plus 0.1 equals 1. So the weights add up to 1. And we've calculated the moving average as 119.1. Now let's look at exponential smoothing. Using exponential smoothing, the forecast for the next period is equal to the forecast for the current period plus a proportion, alpha, of the forecast error in the current period. Sounds complicated. We simply take the forecast for the next period is equal to the forecast for the current period plus a proportion, alpha, of the forecast error for the current period. Let's have a look at how this works. Using exponential smoothing, the forecast is calculated by this little formula here. Now, if you go across here, just put the cursor on the screen. If you go across here to this red one, the red one is the forecast for time period t plus 1 for the next time period. T plus 1 is the next time period. Forecast for the current time period would be t. T is the current time period, t plus 1 is the next time period. So the forecast for the next time period is equal to the forecast for this period, ft, plus alpha, this proportion, and it's the proportion of the actual minus the forecast. So the actual is yt minus the forecast for this time period. Now, that's our little formula, and we would use this formula to try and calculate the exponential smoothing method. Let's put it into our figures, the figures we started with. So we have 10 periods here, 10 weeks. We have the sales figure, let's say for pizzas, over this 10-week period. Now if we take the first one up here, just put the cursor on the screen, if we take this 101, we'll start with the same, because that's what we got. We got sales of 111, so we put in smoothing 111. The second one is 110. This one here is 111. How this works is we would take, if we come down here for each one, if we take, say, 127 here, multiply it by 0.2, if alpha is 0.2, if you make alpha 0.2, so 127 times 0.2 plus 116.26 times 0.8. So 0.2 plus 0.8 is equal to 1. So multiply this by 0.2, this one by 0.8. And if you do that, you get 118.41. And that's how smoothing is calculated. We simply take a figure, 120, let's say. We take this 120 and we take the previous one, which is 125 times 0.2. Then we add 0.8 of this one and it gives us 115. So the smoothing technique would forecast 115.33. The sales was actually 120. And if you look at the chart here, this one here is up and down quite a lot. This one here it's smooth. It's just, and it's increasing. It's not very accurate during these early phases, but later on it sort of picks up. So the longer the time period for this to work, it's argued the greater the reliability of the technique. Now, measuring forecast accuracy. Well, we have the mean square error, the average of the squared forecast errors for the historical data is calculated. The forecasting method or parameter which minimizes this is the mean squared error is then selected. So it's simply we take the errors and square them, and we then try to minimize the average squared error. So one technique. The mean absolute deviation. The mean of the absolute values of all forecast errors is calculated, and the forecasting method or parameters which minimize this measure is selected. The mean absolute deviation measure is less sensitive to individual large forecast errors than the mean squared error measure. So it's a little more stable. It bubbles down to choose the one which gives the best results. Just pick the method which gives the best results and is most reliable over a long period of time. Selecting this one, well, select a 2-period, if you were going to do it in practice, select a 2-period moving average or a 3-period moving average. Select an exponential smoothing of, say, alpha equals 0.1 I should say, or an exponential smoothing of alpha equals 0.2. Ideally, we should try more values for n for the moving average and more alpha for exponential smoothing to determine the best fit with the data. So really it's trial and error. It's not taking alpha equals 0.1, it could be taking alpha equals 0.05 or alpha equals 0.3. Whatever. It's just trying to fit the line best to the original source line. So the original data is plotted out and it's trying to find a smoothing curve for that data which is best and which will in the long run yield the best decisions for the business. Trend projection. Well, if a time series exhibits a linear trend, please note, it has to be linear, then the method of least squares may be used to determine the trend line for the forecast. This is known as ordinary least squares, but it has to be a linear trend. The independent variable is the time period, and the dependent variable is the actual observed value in the time series. So for example, we may look at our original set of data, or a set of data like this one, let's say, and we have a number of weeks here, and again we can use it in Excel. We can go to Excel and simply type in regression. Type in regression and we regress those figures, and you will find that the equation is something like y equals this x plus a constant. What it's saying is that every week that goes by, sales should increase by 6.4, 6.3, 6.4. That's what it's saying. However, the goodness of fit of this line within these data points, the goodness of fit is not very good. The correlation coefficient, when it's squared, just explains 46%. The R squared tells us how good the data, how good the line fits the data. And in this case, it only explains 46% of the data. So in other words, 54% of the data is not being explained. So we've got a trend line. We've got a straight line, trend line, but it's not very good. Now whether you want to base decisions on that or not is debatable. So in this class we've looked at various techniques. We've looked at subjective techniques, the Delphi method and others. We've looked at moving averages and weighted moving averages, and we've come along to regression at the very end as another technique for helping decision making. But that's all I really want to do in this session. It's been a long session. I suggest you stop the video I should say, many times, go back over it, make notes, and do some research into the area yourself and add to your own notes regarding each technique and try to figure out what each technique is trying to do. But we'll leave it for there, and thank you for watching.